Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. I have 2 generous supporters to send a special thank you and shout out to today. I would like to thank existing patron Jeffrey for increasing his prestige to that of the See of Rome. Habemos Jeffrey the Great. I would also like to send out a thank you to our latest patron at the Constantinople level, Sean. Welcome, Jeffrey the Great and Sean the Magnificent. I really incredibly appreciate your support. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy. I am very excited in this very special episode. Paul is a super aficionado of the popes, and we got to talking, and Paul teaches a class about the popes. How did you, I don't think that's your career, but how did you get involved in teaching a class about the popes?
Having been raised Roman Catholic, very early in my college career, despite my accounting major, I ended up with 8 courses in history. I took a course each semester. I finished my education in 4 years and was able to take a history course every semester, which I believe maintained my sanity. So from that standpoint, we had a course on the Reformation, and we had a course on Christianity, the Christian Church, and the history of the Christian Church, and all the eventual splits and everything else. So I was already into it, and I started collecting books on the papacy. And today, my book collection on the papacy exceeds, probably getting close to 200 now. And, you know, some of the books are good, some of them aren't. But I've collected them and started, because of my history love, started giving after dinner speeches and when I was a practicing lawyer in Louisiana on 2 subjects: the history of the papacy and the popes, and the history of the governors of Louisiana. And there's an interesting tie between the two because, as we know, what I've always said about the papacy, I think what fascinates me about it, besides its absolute intrepid nature, and have being able to survive for over 2,000 or almost 2,000, depending on counting, is it's a monument to the foibles of man. But I believe that Father O'Malley at Georgetown, who teaches a course on the history of the popes and the papacy, and he's a history professor, he's a Jesuit, and I like his statement better. He says that the story of the papacy is not one told in a sacristy, and that is a true statement.
Out of all the periods of the papacy, which one do you find the most interesting, or that maybe you get drawn to the most? Because we're talking about a 2,000-year history. There's a lot of different sections in there.
Well, that's a great question, and people break it down different ways. I believe that if I was breaking it down, now my course, I'll tell you how my course is set up first. It's not necessarily how I would break it down if I was doing something further with it. Of course, we begin with whether St. Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and we stop at the donation of Pepin in 756. The second semester, it's a 3-semester course. The second semester, which will be in the spring of 2023, we begin with the crowning of Charlemagne, Caesar Augustus, by Pope Leo III, on Christmas Day 800 in the old St. Peter's Basilica. And we end with Pio IX being a prisoner in the Vatican after Victor Emmanuel unites and forms Italy in 1870. And then the third semester, which will be the fall of 2023, we cover what I call the modern spiritual papacy, where the Pope is no longer a secular ruler except over the Vatican City, from 1870 to. But how I would probably break it down, and how you may break it down, is I believe that from St. Peter to Constantine, when after the battle, over the Milvian Bridge, and he says it's okay to be Christian. I think that was 313 or something like that. And then, of course, the Council of Nicaea is in 325. But the popes from Peter on to Constantine, many of them, or some of them at least, were martyred. But they're all saints. I mean, that's one of the things that when you look at the list, I think I forget which pope is the first one who is not a saint. Liberius. It was Liberius who was actually exiled, but that's in like the late 370s. So every pope until Liberius is a saint, and for better or worse, there you go. And then I think you go from then. As the Western Empire deteriorated and collapsed, Rome, the Catholic Church, or the Christian Church back then, was looked to sort of maintain order. And of course, Rome was not a safe place to live, close to 1,000 years. So really from then, probably till Charlemagne kind of brought some order. He slapped the Lombards back and kind of preserved things. And then you got another era sort of beginning with Charlemagne. And of course, things get rocky within a couple of hundred years. You have the whole hoorah between Henry IV and Gregory VII, the Dictatus Papacy. He wins my award for most hubristic pope. Gnasset even comes up in World War II, which was an interesting comment the Nazis made about we will not go back to Gnasset like Henry IV did, and Gregory VII made him wait out in the snow for 3 days. But probably until you probably go all the way to probably close to 1870 when they lose the Papal States. When all of a sudden the Pope is. I think Victor Emmanuel talked the Austrian troops into going home. And then, of course, they left the Pope with the Swiss Guard, which, 135 or so, guys with sickles weren't exactly much of an army. So there you go. That's how I break it down.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. That's fairly much how I would break it down too, with the maybe I would on the early end, I would break up that long stretch between the 700s ish to the 1870s. I would back it up to the end of Pope Zacharias, the last pope who got his button, you might say, from the Byzantine Empire. But I think the donation of Pepin is a good place to start it, and really do see that the main themes of the papacy, if you're breaking things into eras, goes all the way from the 700s until the 1870s, which is, it's absolutely amazing that something would last that long.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right.
When you have new students come in, or you're doing those informal discussions with people after dinner, do they come in with the certain conceptions or maybe misconceptions that you've seen or heard quite a bit?
Oh, well, first of all, and when I was given these after dinner lectures, Southern Louisiana is predominantly Roman Catholic. So almost everybody who came to these lectures was Roman Catholic. They knew almost nothing about the history of the papacy and were floored by some of the stories. And of course, and there are some rather interesting stories. I always told the Cadaver Synod story, and I always told about the pornocracy and a few other and about Gregory the Seventh and Henry the Fourth. I told that story. Of course, everybody wants to know about the Borgias and the various families, Moravia. Trying to take over, making sure the families are ensconced in the papacy. The Della Roveries. I actually represented as a lawyer a member, a descendant of the Della Rovere. His last name was Rovery. It was
That's so
dropped
cool.
the Della part, but he had clear descendant lines back to the 400 or 500s.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think for today, we're going to take people to the class, and I'm imagining we're going to do some true and false, and this is the pretest that you give to your class. That these are a lot of things that we talked about in the entire podcast, but are these maybe some of these true and false statements you came up with? Are these based on maybe some of the misconceptions and ideas that you've heard along the way?
Yes, they are. Every now and then. Well, I'd say not every now and then. I'd say in most appearances that I made, at some point there was a question about the alleged female pope, Pope Joan. She had to talk about that. There were questions about have popes ever been succeeded by their own children or later descendants? Of course, we know the answer to that is yes. But like I said, for Roman Catholic, the church doesn't really teach much of the history of the popes. And as you know, the story of the Christian church is really independent of the story of the popes and the papacy. It's really, while they have parallel track, if you asked your garden variety person who lived in the Papal States in 900, when the Pope was the ruler of the the duchies that formed the Papal States, do you know who the Pope is? I've seen historians estimate that fewer than 2% of the public could tell you that there was somebody in charge. They knew their local priest. If there was an abbey close by, that they usually knew the abbot or knew who he was. But as far as the Pope, they had very little dealings with them. But as you know, as Europe starts to coalesce into the Pope kind of helps them like he helped Constantine, the Christian church. And Constantine, used the church to try to extend, the life of the Roman Empire, by hitching his wagon to this church that seemed to be popular. And from that standpoint, then you see the jousting. And of course, in the end, the story's kind of predictable because, the Pope's going to lose because the Pope doesn't have an army and the kings always do. So usually it's like Napoleon said, God is on the side with who has the biggest cannon.
Now let's dive into the first statement. So I'll read the statement, give people out there a second or two to think about it, and then I'll give my answer, and you can tell me whether I'm correct or incorrect, and we'll take my score and see how I do on this quiz. There was a female pope named Joan, and we'll give people a chance to record their answer. I'm going to say false on that one. It's a great, great, great story with so much history over hundreds of years. Am I correct or incorrect with my false?
You are absolutely correct. The time period, it varies depending on the story, but I think most of the alleged Pope, and there's actually there's a pretty entertaining movie that I've seen of the story of Pope Joan, and I have a couple of books, about the Pope Joan mystique, if you will. And it seems somewhere between like 855 and 858, which of course was a pretty sketchy time in the papacy. I believe, if my memory's correct, that was right about the time of the Benedict who was Pope 3 times. It was Benedict the Third was 855 to 858, and he's not the one that was Pope 3 times. I'm sorry, that's a but it was a Benedict, like I thought, and that was when Pope Joan allegedly served. But no, the story is it's a fascinating one, but it's not.
It's really interesting. The story unfolded. I believe the first written evidence of it was in around the year 1000, and it was a really bare bones account. And then there's another account of it from the 1200s that's a little bit more fleshed out, and then there's another account of it maybe 100 or so years later that's even more fully fleshed out. But there were certain people within the Catholic Church that actually believed that there was a woman pope.
Oh yes, yeah, there were.
And then I believe it was a Protestant historian in the early, I want to say the 1600s, who actually debunked it, which I found that really interesting, that it was a Protestant who was really the one who put an end to that. It was not historically accurate.
Yes, yeah, I agree. That was and actually that was some pretty good detective work. If you read much of the depths that historian went to get the scoop, to get the real story, and all of the study. And actually, I give the church a great deal of credit for actually cooperating in that. And the church probably wanted that story debunked, or at least I would think the popes back then would want that story debunked. But still, 1600s, relations between the Protestants and the Christians are still pretty raw. Martin Luther, was less than 100 years before. So I thought it was pretty remarkable that because he really examined some Vatican, well, it wasn't Vatican, but the Lateran. Well, no, I guess they'd moved to, but not long in the Vatican. I think the church probably wanted that debunked, but it was unusual, at least ironic. But maybe not, because the church did a lot to retard education in southern Italy, with the Index of Forbidden Books and the North tended to do better economically, and in part because they believe the church sort of with its strident how it dealt with Michelangelo, how it dealt with several others, Copernicus, it sort of suppressed education, or science.
Now let's take a look at the second statement, and I'll give my answer, my first thought answer to it, and then I did a little research on it. But so I'll give you my first one. The youngest pope was elected at age 16. So we'll give our people out there listening a chance to think their answer over. I said false on that one as my first thought. Am I true or am I false? Or am I correct or incorrect?
No, I believe you. I believe that you're correct. But it's not far off, because clearly, I believe it was John the 12th was elected at 19, and that was the pornocracy pope, and died at 29. And there are two stories about his death. He either had a stroke during sex, or he was killed by the husband of the lady he was having sex with. Historians have both stories that I've read. So that was 19, and that was a confirmed date. So 16, like I said, the statement is false, but it's close. It's close to being true.
I had read some things about Benedict the Ninth, that he was really young, and some people said that he could have been as young as 10 or 12, which is, that's so off the wall. It almost is believable, but most scholars don't ascribe to that, and they think he could have been as young as his late teens, or maybe even into his late 20s. But even in his late 20s, the canons of Nicaea, I think, it was one of the early ecumenical council canons, said that you had to be, I think, 30 before you were even made a priest. So to say somebody could be elected pope at even as late as your late 20s is really, something was seriously wrong going on at that time.
Well, now remember, Benedict IX is the pope who was pope 3 times. Okay, but he was a member of the Theophylact family, Moravia and all that. He was a layman when he was elected. He abdicated. He sold the office to his godfather, Sylvester III. He got appointed, according to some of the stories I've read, at 14 by Count Gregory. And he sold the papacy for £1,500. He was actually the last of the Theophylact hold on the papacy that had lasted for almost 150. One family controlled who the pope was. Another thing, you asked about what people were surprised about. A couple of other things come to mind. One is people didn't realize that the popes weren't always selected by the College of Cardinals. But no, that's the great investiture controversy of 1059. When that comes into effect, for many years, the papacy was essentially more or less like a public election of the Christians of Rome, and that's why it became political. And it's the whole basis for the Cadaver Synod. Formosus was pope from 891 to 896. Formosus dies early in 896. He's succeeded by a pope who lasts 15 days and dies the way probably 10 or 12 popes died, of gout. Can you imagine? I've had gout in my big toe, but I can't imagine having a body so racked with gout, which is very painful, to actually die from it. But he died from it, and subsequently Stephen or depending on how you count the Stephen, 6th or 7th, he's elected by the mob in 896 later. And of course, he's the one who orders Formosus's body exhumed and then put on trial with Pope Stephen as the prosecutor. And there's some great paintings that you can Google showing, the cadaver, the rotting cadaver, dressed in papal raiments on the chair of St. Peter in the Lateran Palace, with Pope Stephen screaming at this dead body. It's macabre. It's hard to believe. But the crime, his was of course charged with several crimes. But the biggest crime was, of course, usurping the papacy, which, of course, Stephen himself was guilty. And of course, when they determined that Formosus was guilty, what does he do? He chops the 3 blessing fingers off, throws the body in the Tiber River. Formosus's gang goes and gets the body, and then they go looking for Stephen, and they get him, and they kill him. It's one of those things. It's like Father O'Malley says, it's a story, not best told. It's not a story told in a sacristy.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. That whole section of the papacy, the pornocracy or the dark ages of the papacy, it's so bad. And I think people kind of get hung up on the Renaissance popes because they were kind of a little flamboyant and flashy. But in a lot of ways, a lot of those popes weren't that bad, and they were semi-reforming. These ones in the 900s into the very early 1000s, this is bad. There's just no other way to put it.
Well, that's right. And I think there's actually a stretch of 50 years where there were 25 popes, which doesn't speak well for continuity, if you will. But I think it speaks a lot to the parallels, the history of what was going on in the city of Rome. One of the reasons why, for the Avignon papacy, was, Rome was, kind of swampy, and, it tended to get plague, and, if they weren't being sacked or harassed by the Lombards or some of the other barbarians, eventually, when Muhammad comes, they're getting raided by the Muslims. It was just not a safe place. So I think that one thing that sometimes people forget, and they say, well, Charlemagne kind of was crowned Caesar Augustus by Pope Leo III. People forget why Charlemagne was in town that Christmas. In 799, Pope Leo III was kidnapped, and they almost cut his tongue out. And he summoned, he begged for Charlemagne to bring his army to restore order in the city of Rome, which Charlemagne did. And he came back, and he actually chaired a council earlier in December in the year 800, and was at mass at this old St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day. And Leo III comes from behind and puts the crown on his head and proclaims him Caesar Augustus. Then all of a sudden you have the Holy Roman Emperor, who was neither holy nor Roman, for that matter.
Let's move on to the next statement, and this one ties into something you said earlier. So it's but I think it's worth talking a little bit more about. It's at one time laymen elected the Pope, and that's, like you said, that's true. And I think that's got to be a mind-blowing thing for a lot of people, that it's not this group of bishops, a lot of whom are older. I mean, most of them, I think, are in their 60s or their 70s. It's that at one time, everybody just came who was available and elected the Pope. I think that's one of the things that, even for myself, that I thought was mind-blowing, that it would have ever have been a popular election.
Well, that's exactly right. And one of the other things that blows people's mind is, when you tell them, well, the College of Cardinals wasn't always there, and they didn't always elect the Pope. The other thing that blows people's mind is today we're used to popes taking a different name. But until really around the late 1000s, up to 1100, really there'd only been one pope who took a different name, and it was a pope that became pope in 530. He was a Roman, before then, I mean, if you were Greek, Agapetus, you had a Greek name. Um, Formosus was Roman. It's a Roman name. But Mercurius was elected Pope in 533. And I think there was some, Mercurius is obviously the name of a Roman pagan god. And I think that's why he took the name John II, because his predecessor, I believe, was a martyr, John I. And, but that's the only one that changed names. And then people are surprised when you tell them, well, they haven't all changed their name since then, because there've actually been a pope or two who actually kept their name. And I believe it was one elected in 1555. But I'm drawing a blank on the name. You may remember it. Might have been Marcellus or something like that. It was a Roman name. I remember that.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I haven't done any real reading into this, but my thought is maybe that this renaming of a pope once they become pope may have been introduced from the East, where it was more common for monks to take a new name once they became a monk. And maybe that was something that slowly started to become more of a phenomenon or a custom in the West based on Eastern monasticism. That's just a pure guess, but that's the dates kind of line up for that.
Well, my only question about that would be, when is the mutual excommunication with the patriarch? Was it 1053?
1054, I believe.
1053, 1054, somewhere in there. And of course, that they, in like I believe it was the early 1400s. The East and West almost reunited. And in fact, they had a council in the Western territory, and the Greek representative agreed. Yeah, we're gonna get back together. And they went home to Constantinople, and it was shot down. And of course, the whole thing was rendered moot in 1453 when the Turks took Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul.